Ferdia, how do you pronounce Thucydides?
Thucydides, I hope.
Thucydides.
Yeah, that's what I say. It's my story and I'm sticking to it.
And when did you read Thucydides first?
I read Thucydides when I was 15. Oh, no, I wasn't 15. I was 17 years of age. I was in school. And we picked it up. I think typically when you were studying, it was for studying the classics, the book that would be chosen would be about Alexander, the life of Alexander. And the vast majority of students did that, but our class did Thucydides. And I just fell in love. I don't know exactly what it was, or I do. I felt what struck me immediately was there's this book about a conflict 2,500 years ago, and yet the voice felt oddly contemporary, the concerns felt oddly contemporary. And I found myself immersed in it.
Could you tell us about the particular passage in that book that might have nourished your novel?
Okay, so the book is about the 27-year war between Athens and Sparta that spreads and spills all across the Greek world. And at the heart of, I've heard it described in another sense as a story of the conflict, but in another way, a story of Athens as a Greek tragedy about the fall of Athens. Athens is hubris. It started its empire almost in defense against Persian imperialism, and then it became imperialistic itself. And at the heart of that fall, you had this decision to invade Sicily. The Athenians presented it as a humanitarian intervention. This is going to be quick and easy. Quite the contrary, they're completely destroyed, and thousands of prisoners are then left in these quarries outside the city of Syracuse, which you can visit today.
And Thucydides has a description of this.
He describes this. He tells us, Thucydides gives us the first part of my novel's inspiration. He tells us thousands went in, and that within in and around a year, pretty much everyone was dead, and they were given a pint of barley water as rations, starvation rations, and almost no one survived. That was the first point of inspiration. The second, but actually the narrative came out of a passage from Plutarch's Life of Nicias, where he tells us this addendum that some of these Athenian prisoners actually survived because there was such a passion for Athenian drama, and in particular the work of Euripides, that if you were an Athenian soldier and you could recite lines from Medea or another well-known play, literally not singing for your supper, singing for survival, you would be given extra rations, and some were actually taken away.
And could you tell me when you came across that passage?
I came across that passage, so I was 17 when I read Thucydides, and I became just fell in love with the book, became obsessed with the book, and then I went to study classics in university, and
Was that in University College Dublin?
University College Dublin,
yeah.
And I was about 19 when I came across Plutarch. And I would just read it for fun. I would read Plutarch's lives, just for the crack.
Yes.
Where he'd compare basically the lives of the great Greeks and Romans. And as a Greek, he would often be more favourable in his description of the Greeks.
Of the 20th century conflict, I mean, we're both Irish, and it's certainly when I was growing up, into the 70s, 1970s, 1980s, what was happening in Northern Ireland, which wasn't our country. I mean, we were in Southern Ireland, so it wasn't our police, it wasn't our army, but that the daily news coming about what felt like a sort of conflict between tribes or levels of cruelty, tit-for-tat murders. I just wondered, for your generation, did that trickle down? Did that sort of come as daily news that began to matter?
It did, it absolutely did. I think it's like that strength, in Irish history, you're always learning about the colonisation, the relationship between Ireland and England, and then you had the Troubles going on. So we didn't have direct experience, but every now and then I remember there would be a bomb scare in the square where I grew up, with the local shopping centre. There was a bomb scare, and that happened exceedingly rarely, but it did happen. And of course we would be looking at the news of what was happening in the north and hoping that some solution could be found, some resolution.
I was explaining your name to a whole lot of Italians. I've become an expert on your name, Ferdia, because it's in the ancient Irish story, the Táin, which is pre-Christian also, which is a single combat between the hero, the implacable, brave hero, Cuchulainn, and his cousin or semi-brother, Ferdia.
Yes.
And it's the best piece of writing in this I suppose, this massive epic, the Táin, which is just the two men every day going back to fight. But the idea, those images of violence, those images of just immense bloodshed, but even in other passages in the Táin, the idea of the numbers of people killed, that names of places came from the blood spilled in those places. It wasn't about the beauty of the rivers, but about the actual redness of the blood. So that idea of violence going on in both myth and in legend, but also in the daily business of the news, not far away, that enters into the spirit somehow of anyone living in Southern Ireland in your generation. Would that make any sense?
I think it does. I think it certainly does, that awareness. It's very true. Irish history, in many ways, most nations' history there's a history. History, when you go into it, is often very brutal. Irish history is absolutely like that. And the Irish mythology, or even more than Greek mythology, seems to always end in a tragedy. No one, and that somehow maybe makes it more beautiful. And the myth of Ferdia and Cuchulainn is certainly that. Yeah, that's an interesting point. We, growing up, learning about these great periods of loss, conflicts that seem insurmountable, that seem unsolvable, it definitely influences the way that you experience the world and the kind of narratives you're drawn towards.
When did you go first to Syracuse, or Syracuse? There's a Syracuse in upstate New York. You didn't go there.
It's not based on New York, Syracuse.
You went to the one in Sicily. When did you go there first?
When did I go there? So I knew about the novel. I was inspired to write the novel by reading the passage from Plutarch.
You mean when you were 20?
I read the passage, and I knew that was some. In that strange way, I'd read it, and then I began to write. I began to write initially short stories. I always knew I would like to write something set during the classical period, but I didn't know how I would do it. And I read the passage again from Plutarch's Life of Nicias, and it was like a door opening up. This is what I want to write about. You know, that strange juxtaposition of cruelty and empathy. It's, in one way, you could take it as a beautiful story about art bringing us together, but it's also very dark. Yeah. You know, we will empathize with you if you've got Greek tragedy, otherwise we'll leave you. So then I knew I I've written maybe the first chapter. And I think I've heard you speak about for you, the research, when you're writing, you like to, being in the place where the book is set is quite important for you.
Yeah. You get something.
I think so.
Yeah.
It's
so when did you go there?
I went there when I was 20. I'd written maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and my wife and I, we were quite broke, so I didn't have the money. It had to be a short trip. Yeah. I would have loved to have written a section of the novel there. We went to Syracuse in winter because the accommodation was more affordable. Yeah. And we went to the quarries, and we went to the museum and where the battle sites in Epipolae, and we had old maps from Thucydides to try to guide our path. And I agree with you. In that sense that there is something almost by osmosis in a place. Yeah.
Now talk to me about the quarry. Talk to me about just seeing the quarry and that idea. This surely has to be dead space by this time. I mean, just think of 2,500 years and all the other things that have occurred in Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, in the 20th century even. This quarry, nonetheless, has an extraordinary presence, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And maybe it almost helped going there in winter, because if we'd gone there in summer, the height of tourist season, you'd have people running around with ice creams.
Yeah, I know.
It would be a kind of almost a Disneyland. But we went, and it was the odd tourist, but it was essentially empty, and it had that. You're just thinking, is there something that as thousands of people lost their lives here 2,500 years ago? Is there anything that has lingered, or is it only because I'm aware of it and there's nothing? And if so, what did it all mean? Yeah. It was very impactful for me. Also, I saw, which you could maybe know from looking at the maps, there's the Greek amphitheatre. Yeah. 5 minutes away. Yeah. So made from limestone, it was almost certainly quarried from this limestone pit. Yeah. This strange thing. So this concentration camp where the Athenians had died, the quarry stone there was then used to create a play, to perform the plays produced by that culture. it opened up things.
Did you ever write short stories set in your world, contemporary, about your life, about being a teenager or a young man in Dublin?
Ancient Greece or nothing.
You never did?
No, I did. And in a strange way, when I was trying to write this novel, what voice will I use? I was initially just writing short stories and actually a novel set in the Dublin that I grew up in.
Right.
And in a way, there is that clear link between those contemporary fictional Dublin short stories in my own voice or in a voice parallel or adjacent to my own, and then the voice that I chose to use for this novel.
Yeah. One of the other things that you get in Ireland is the question of translation, especially from, say, ancient Irish texts. And in about 1900, W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory, who were, I suppose, the two sort of engines really working towards a sort of cultural revival in Ireland, set about rethinking the notion of translation. That if you had an ancient Irish text, like the Cuchulainn Ferdia story, for example, which Lady Gregory set about translating in about 1900, that what language do you use to translate it into? Because if you're saying you translate it into English, the question is, what's English? Because if you're saying the English that people speak in, say, the British Parliament, or the English of legislation, or the English of, a manual, the sort of received standard business of English, who speaks that, in fact? Come to Ireland, cross the country, go east to west. More and more you're moving into a language being spoken, which is, you could call it English, but nonetheless it uses so many idioms.
Yeah.
And the idioms are translated actually from Irish. And so if you found a way of translating an ancient text that used this, that made use of what was called, Yeats called a living speech, then you would get much more energy. Instead of this Victorian English you translate things into, you get this living speech. So I think it's been a big subject that has preoccupied people in Ireland for more than 100 years. So the question then is, since there's so many novels set in the ancient world, I mean, from Robert Graves' work to more recent work, what language do you use? What idiom do you use? If instead of language, what idiom of English do you use? And who's entitled to use what? And do you have to use standard English? Since standard English seems to be the dead language, almost our dead language is standard English. So you could translate it into that and everyone would say, well, it's your command of a dead. So talk to me about working on the texture of the language of the book.
Okay, that's a wonderful question.
It's a long question, I'm sorry.
No, but I love it because Lady Gregory and Lady Gregory's translation of those myths, I read them growing up and had an almost oblique influence in one of the characters, Turin, in the novel, was inspired by reading The Sons of Turin from her translation. And that was very much on my mind. How do you, and it's wonderful that they were trying to wrestle with this issue as well. How do you bring an ancient text to life? Or how do you try to evoke an ancient world in a way that is authentic, that isn't gimmicky, that gives you a sense of it, but also says something to the day? One of the inspirations was actually reading Aristophanes' plays, reading contemporary translations, reading translations of Greek tragedy and comedy. And when you read Aristophanes' plays, you realize that formal English that we take as a given in the tragic mode completely disappears. They're bawdy, they're full of slang, they're irreverent, they're crude. And they're also one of the only Athenian plays of that period really about the ordinary people. They're not about mythic gods and kings. That was also like a door opening for me. Reading other works of historical fiction, I think that David Mitchell talks about this idea of bygoneese. That if you bygoneese, you set something in the past and we just use a more formal register.
Yes.
And I think that's it. If I wrote this novel in a kind of Jane Austen or early 20th century register, that would initially be perceived as, oh, Ferdia has really done his research. He knows how the ancient Greeks sounded. Which of course that's just a convention. Also, Sicily was an island that had been colonized a few hundred years before my work is set by mainland Greece. Syracuse was a Greek colony. So I wanted to, in my own way, playfully convey the idea that this is Greece, but it's not Greece, or it's Greece on the periphery, in the way that Ireland was part of Britain, but it was also not. That insider that's also an outsider. And you would have an old language, potentially.
So it's that irony of colonization where historians and theorists could later think, what a strange, that Ireland was colonised, and every person went around looking colonised and being colonised, and your dreams were fully colonised. And then you went and you experienced it. You thought, actually, it's not as simple as that. It's an irony. Sometimes it's a joke. Sometimes it's it's about the post boxes are English and the postal system, but actually, as people sit around at night and make jokes, those jokes are not the jokes of the colonised, unless, of course, unless dark, deep laughter is a big thing for colonised people to do. It's a way of exercising power,
Completely.
to get something that was meant to be sad and to start seeing if you could laugh at it.
That's
a
wonderful
This is
point.
a theory of your novel that I'm not going to go any further with. But
I like it, though.
But
I like this.
I do want to
Tell
know.
me more.
Like, how come you won the Bollinger P.G. Wodehouse Award for the best comic novel of the year about one of the saddest stories we have? So could you take us through how this is done?
Thank you. Well, I think part of a bit of luck on in terms of the jury, but for me, this is I've described the novel as almost like a tragedy narrated by a character who thinks he's in a comedy. But also, in a sense, it's the circumstances are tragic. If this novel were narrated by Gelon, who's the other main character, it would be uninterruptedly tragic. We would have a tragic tone in a tragic voice describing tragic material. And I think sometimes that more oblique, indirect, that dissonance between voice and telling and what is being told can be quite powerful. I also felt it was probably true. A Syracusan who just narrowly escaped having their island conquered, probably being killed in a battle or enslaved. They're not going to necessarily look at these Athenian prisoners and think of the Geneva Convention, or well, obviously didn't exist, but the humanity, we're all one. They're probably going to be quite celebratory. That concentration camp, essentially, that prisoner of war camp, was a 15-minute walk from where people were going to buy their food for the week, where they were going to pray in their temples. So that was, and Syracuse, like Athens, was a democracy that was voted on. So I thought it would be true that the attitude of the people, a lot of them would be, this is something to celebrate.
How gradual was this process of seeing a way of writing about this, finding the style, but also finding the character? As you say, a brilliant idea that someone whose tendencies are comic, whose general relationship to the world is not high tragedy, writing about the saddest or most tragic. How quickly does this come? Does it begin with another version that you then discard or abandon or forget or revise?
Does it? It began with vague third person, in the year of 412, almost like a 19th century novel, jottings, and then it began as, it's a mysterious process. We're not always aware of what we're up to. There's an inadvertency, I think, to the creative process that can also lead to the best things when you're not fully sitting there with a grid. One day I wrote I knew I wanted to write about these prisoners of war performing Greek tragedy, and I wrote the lines. So Gelon says to me, let's go down and feed the Athenians. The weather's perfect for feeding Athenians. And it made me laugh. It made me laugh. And
hold on, did you write this, or did it come to you as you're walking on the street? I mean, how does that happen?
It happened. I was writing it, but it was like a voice. With that line, I understood who this character was. I understood where they were coming from, the way that they saw the world. There was a relationship. Who is this Gelon guy? Who says it to him? And you build it.
And there's a particular Dublin tone, which is, it's not exactly anarchic as much as it has no respect for anyone under certain conditions. So no matter what's happening, if I remember if someone won a small raffle, you'd be coming out of the pub having just won a small 5 shillings or something, and someone said, "Oh, the fucking millionaire." That was, no matter what you do, you'd be crossing the Liffey saying, "Yeah, look at the," no matter what grand thing is coming, the Pope is coming to Dublin and say, "Yeah, you're going to the man, you're going to confession." The Pope. It's a way of bringing everything down.
The Pope's got notions.
But it's a sort of permanent wit as well, that you're valued by the fact that these jokes you're making at the expense of the river, the Pope, the important people, have to be good. you know,
Yes.
and that therefore this is what's treasured. If there are three people walking down the street, one of them is making sour remarks to the other two are laughing. And that's part of the life of the city in a way you don't see it in Paris.
Yeah.
You know, if there are three people walking down the street, there's something else happening.
Yeah.
With that business.
No, you're completely right. There is that irreverent undercutting. If you stick your head up for a moment, you could be fairly sure that someone's going to take you down that peg or two in Ireland or in Dublin.
Yeah, but that
certainly.
you yourself become the person taking down others, that you can't survive company, because if you're not making those jokes, you could go home.
Yeah, you've lost your season pass.
So the idea then of taking one of the great sad European stories, the extraordinary pain of it, that's described so beautifully in this book that you read when you were 17, and finding this tone for it, and the idea then that this business of being crazy about books. So there's an autobiographical element in this, isn't there? That
Completely.
You too would want this. This is a thing you would care about. What do these people have? What do they know? Is there something we might get from them?
Yeah, you take what you know. Like in some ways, there's a section. This part of the novel is set in this bar called Dismas's, and Gelon, who loves Athenian drama, is obsessed with the idea. There's a chair called Homer's chair, where Homer is reported to have sat on, and he has to have his drink in Homer's chair. And that was inspired. I was living in Paris, and there was like a bar, and there was a Beckett's chair, you know, where Samuel Beckett would come in and would have his pastis. So that sense of where there are two cities. There's the city as it is, and it is lived, and there's the city as the past, and the legends that were there. And as I wrote that, almost these autobiographical things, that fed into the depiction there of that space.
Okay,
of the past.
A few questions, but there's just one word needed for the reply. You write better day or night?
Day.
Laptop or pen and paper?
Laptop.
Do you draft? Do you know what you're writing each time you come to a scene, or do you start a scene without knowing? A long question, but you know where I'm coming from.
I know exactly what you mean. Both. Sometimes I'll know, it'll be okay, I'm on this chapter, I'll write chronologically. Sometimes it will be very improvised and it will go when I think it's important for me to have freedom, to have a level of the unexpected, the exploration in it, rather than ticking off beats. Although sometimes I will know the section that I'm writing.
Do you often brood darkly on the fact that so many of the Greek plays are missing?
I do. I remember when I was researching this, coming across again and again that there was this Greek, Euripides' most beloved play was Telephus, and it's completely lost to us. And this sense that his blockbuster play, probably the play that we would have had them, part of me thought when I was writing it, maybe I'll make Telephus up.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does. It bothers me that Sophocles, we have so few Sophocles, so few Aeschylus. It definitely does. But I suppose then I'm grateful for what we do have.
How long did it take you to write?
Took me many years.
Really?
Yeah, it did.
It doesn't feel like that.
That's lovely to hear that.
It feels like a novel that could have been written in a good Irish winter.
Yeah, and I think it could. It was that thing of I began it, got lost in the research. I was writing this whole section from the Athenian perspective. I deleted over 50,000 words.
Hold on, at what point did you delete?
I deleted it maybe a year in. I realized that it was, some of it I thought was good. You know, it was about the Athenian invasion. So there's a character who dies in the very first chapter of the novel, and I basically then told their story so you would understand Paches and the various Athenians who were in this quarry. And I just realized, although some of it was good and interesting and working, the novel was not the stronger for it.
Did this come from reading what you'd written, or did it come from thinking about what you'd written?
It came from both. It came from both. It came from reading what I'd written and thinking we're going to need a bigger boat.
Do you have a different night and morning in that respect? You become more suspicious of yourself in the morning.
There are those flights. When you're writing something in the evening and you're just like, I've changed the game. things will, and then you read it in the morning and you go, actually.
I have a long, lugubrious question. There's a big, long correspondence in the 1960s between the Californian poet Robert Duncan and his friend Denise Levertov, who was also a poet and was more an activist. This is the time of the Vietnam War. This is the time when people were talking about commitment, when, you know, every poetry reading was a fundraiser for some group who were anti-war. And the correspondence goes on where Denise Levertov starts to say it is our job to oppose evil. And Robert Duncan starts to pull back on that and say, is that our job, to oppose evil? And he starts to write back to her to say, surely it's not, that's not our job. Other people can do that. It's our job to imagine evil. And she goes, hold on a minute, that's not what I do. And so they almost fall out over this. And it's a massive volume of correspondence. I mean, I'll summarize it for you. But it's that idea of, if you were to imagine what it would be like for that number of people to be held in a quarry over those circumstances, to try and see it from the perspective not of high morality or the Geneva Convention, but of what it might have been like for someone who was alive then, who saw it from a number of perspectives, and your job is to imagine, I suppose, the ordinariness of some days and the extraordinariness of others, and how people's desires are strange. People want a bit of a play. You survive because you know a line of a play. Yeah. That all of that has to be, I suppose, trying to imagining in a way the complexity surrounding what is effectively evil.
Yes, absolutely, completely.
So that's a really long question, I know.
No, but I agree, and it speaks to that on one level. I think if literature can, you know, speak truth to power, combat evil, all the better. That's and it's good, and then it's good literature in of itself. That's a wonderful thing. I believe, you know, we all have moral responsibilities. However, I don't believe that a novel should be a polemic. I think it needs to, and often actually the best for you. I think of Dostoevsky, who was writing in the service of Russian Orthodoxy and Christianity. Often his best work has within it the seeds of its own contradiction. He is interesting because he will set out to do something and then it will do the opposite, or will display the contrary opinion with as much robustness as he does his own opinion. And I think that's what the best literature is, almost hyper empathetic, but not from one point of view, rather than, as you described, to give a voice to it and give a voice to the alternative, than approaching it as if you have a thesis statement that you're going to prove.
I suppose finally the question is the playfulness of the form. In other words, that there is a great European tradition of the fellow at the edge of the crowd who's going to pick pockets or make jokes, or no matter what's going on, use it to his own advantage, even if it's just a way of telling the story. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have the king has no clothes, but we also have Quixote and Sancho Panza wandering around, and really it's a question of the playfulness. That's the form, even the picaresque form itself, but also just the novel form itself is open to playfulness in the way that it's not really as open to earnestness. That you could try and write a really earnest novel about, my heart was broken when I went to that quarry, my tears went, my salt dribbled down my cheeks. I thought of those poor people. And then on the way home you think, no, I didn't. I thought of something much more, I suppose, banal, but also much funnier, more complex. I thought of a fellow as a sort of chancer who would have other motives. And these motives are both comic and tragic, but more than anything, they're playful. They're allowing a sort of glitter to occur on the page. And that is a fundamental aspect, not only of European culture, but European political culture. We keep looking at our betters and making jokes about their nose, the king has no clothes. So just that the very form you're writing in itself seems more open to playfulness than earnestness.
I agree, yeah. I think, and you can be deadly serious as you make jokes. For example, Don Quixote, I also read that when I was very young, and I think it's one of those books that just changed the way I thought about life and about books. I found it very, very funny. And then I found it very, very moving. And I think the line between those two things is a lot closer than we would think. And I think in many ways it's more moving for being funny and sly and playful, rather than, as you say, going, isn't this poor deluded man who thinks he's a knight, and isn't it? No, finding that other way, finding that oblique direction. And as you describe, I'm reading old books of like diaries of people visiting Ireland in the 19th century, and there's constantly that description where the person narrating the diary feels like they might be getting made fun of, but they're not quite sure. So that humor is always, feels like there's a through line of that humor that camouflages itself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Colm. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.